Thank you very much, Clinton, for your kind introduction. What an honor it is to be able to introduce the gentleman I'm about to call upon to address us. One of the thrills that I get in life is to introduce a friend to a friend, and that is the privilege that I have this afternoon. It was 50 years ago, on the 6th of July. I was standing in the back of the crowd at the Truman Library with my lawyer friend from Kansas City, Austin Shute. And those memories of that day keep flooding back to me. After the ceremony, I was on the back stoop waiting for my ride, and I thought I recognized the elderly gentleman standing next to me. And on about the third look, my gosh, that's Herbert Hoover. And then with the gentleman I was with that day, we went over to the Truman residence and had the opportunity to visit with the Chief Justice Earl Warren, which of course was a real thrill. Today we're commemorating the life and times of President Harry S. Truman by way of his library. What a wonderful institution this is, and I know he enjoyed it, and through the years we not only have scholars, we have, as a result of its existence, many, many young people that are learning lessons therefrom, but more important, receiving inspiration from yesteryear, from Harry Truman. It was 1935. The newly elected United States Senator from Missouri went up to Kirksville and was visiting with the president of the Northeast Missouri State College. And the president of that college introduced the new United States Senator to a young student by the name of Fred Schwingle. President of the student body, made the dean's list. He's president of this and vice president of that. And the senator ignored all of that and looked at young Fred and said, "Young man, if you want to be a good American, you must know your history." Fred Schwingle never forgot those words that newly elected United States Senator Harry Truman told him. Fred Schwingle later spent 10 years in the United States House of Representatives from Iowa, and later in later life became the historian of the United States Capitol and would tell that story at the drop of a hat. And that's what this institution, the Truman Library, does. It gives you the lessons and the inspiration of Harry Truman. I've had two other occasions to be with President Clinton honoring President Truman. One was the naming of the Harry S. Truman State Department building in Washington, D.C., really at the urging of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And the other was at the commissioning of the USS Harry S. Truman at Norfolk, Virginia. On that occasion, the prospective captain asked me if I would speak because he knew I had an acquaintance with the late Harry Truman, and of course I was thrilled, and President Clinton was to be there. I spoke at the commissioning of the USS Harry S. Truman for 23 minutes, and ladies and gentlemen, President Clinton only spoke for 21. So I will not break my 23-minute record. Let me say it is a distinct honor to present to you one of America's finest in history, gentleman who makes things happen not just while he was president, but he does today. He and his wonderful, remarkable, charming wife have been such good friends to the Skelton family through the years. It is my distinct honor, my distinct privilege to introduce to you America's 42nd President, President Bill Clinton. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, please. Thank you. I sometimes think the most important lesson for any former president to learn is never to forget that he ain't there anymore. You almost dislodged the lesson from my mind with that wonderful welcome. Thank you very much. I am delighted and profoundly honored to be here. I thank my great friend Ike Skelton for that introduction. He came through the line today with his son, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Skelton, who has served our country for 20 years. I thank them both for what they've done for the national security. One of the best things about being president when I was is that I knew I could always get the right answer about what we should do for the American military if I just asked Ike. And he is a national treasure of whom Missouri should be very proud. I also want to say, as he indicated, that Hillary and I loved his wife Susie very much. The only thing that's keeping this whole day from being absolutely perfect for me is that she's not here, although I suspect she is. And it may be that telepathically Ike and I will both get corrections on our remarks after this event. She certainly was never shy about correcting either one of us when I was president. I want to thank Congressman Emanuel Cleaver for being here with his family and for his long friendship. He supported me so strongly when I ran for president, he was even willing to jog in a charity run with me. I don't know if he remembers that, but we both somehow managed to make it. Dr. Devine, thank you for your work for the library, and Alex Burden, thank you. Governor Sebelius, thanks for coming over from Kansas. And for answering the question, what's the matter with Kansas? Nothing anymore, thanks to you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mayor Reimel, Mayor Funkhauser, former Mayor Kay Barnes, former Congresswoman Karen McCarthy, thank you for your friendship to me and Hillary and for your support for what I did as president. Bill Nelson, the members of the library board, and the members of the Missouri legislature and other public officials who are here, I thank you so much for coming. Harry Truman was a hero
to me from the time I was old enough to look at politics. I knew first by word of mouth because my family didn't have a television until I was almost 10, which meant that the first time I had a chance to watch politics, and I did, riveted, was the 1956 conventions, where I watched President Eisenhower renominated and Adlai Stevenson renominated, and John Kennedy tried to become the nominee for vice president. He lost. It was the best thing that ever happened to him, as we all know. What I knew about Truman, I knew from the stories of my family. My family who loved Roosevelt and loved Harry Truman, who identified with Harry Truman because he came from such modest circumstances, and who identified with Harry Truman because he was for civil rights, something that was relatively rare among white Southerners in the 40s and 50s and 60s of modest means and limited education, who liked Harry Truman because he wasn't embarrassed to be bookish. I came from family members that I was the first person in my family ever to go to college, and my grandparents on my mother's side went to a tiny, tiny little school in a town called Bodcaw that still exists and has the same 50 people now it had about 60 years ago. But they prided themselves on believing that thinking was important and that what you knew mattered. And so they admired Harry Truman, and they got me to admire him. In 1984, I was profoundly honored as a young governor to be asked to speak at the Democratic National Convention simply to give a tribute to Harry Truman. I did it, and I couldn't help thinking if we had learned a little more about his politics, we'd have been running better than my party did in the 1980s. In 1992, when I was running for president, we kicked off the general election campaign on Labor Day right here in Independence because I wanted people to believe that if I were elected, I would try to honor the values, the policy, the direction, and the attitudes of President Truman. Clifton, after I was elected, your mother was uncommonly kind to my wife and to my daughter, with whom she identified, as you might imagine. And one night, early in my first term, Hillary invited your parents to dinner at the White House. And she fretted about it the whole day, you know. She wanted the food to be right and the setting to be right. She was just brimming with gratitude and anxiety. And the White House now has this beautiful dining room on the second floor where the Lincoln bedroom is and the Queen's bedroom and the presidential living quarters and the children's living quarters. That was established by Jackie Kennedy with this incredibly beautiful wallpaper going back to the early 19th century, depicting various American scenes, including some military scenes, with all the rage when it was revealed, when Mrs. Kennedy did that famous tour of the White House. So we set up the dinner there. Hillary and I in Chelsea, we never had dinner there unless somebody came. We ate in the kitchen at night. Felt more like home. But we wanted to put on the dog, you know, for Margaret and Clifton. Now, before Jackie Kennedy and President Kennedy came to the White House, First Family went downstairs to dinner every night. And there was a private dining room right off the state dining room, a smaller one where the First Family ate. From the time the White House was open in 1800 for 150 years plus until the Kennedys moved to the White House. So this was going to be the first time Margaret and her husband had ever had dinner in this room. So we had the best time, and, you know, Margaret talked and told stories, and it was just a perfect evening until I ran into the famous Truman candor. So after we had talked about everything under the sun, I said, well, Margaret, how do you like this Kennedy dining room? She said, oh, it's all right, Mr. President, but really I don't think people should eat on the same floor they sleep. So I said, you know, that's what I loved about your dad. Thanks for the answer. After I left the White House and Hillary went to the Senate, we had occasion once to go down to Key West because we had some friends who lived there and they wanted to do a little event for her. And I actually asked to go to somebody else's political event, which is a form of insanity, I think, once you get free of it. But I did it so I could go see Truman's little White House in Key West. And we stayed in that wonderful place. I got to look at the books President Truman read, to frequent the rooms that he haunted, to walk around in the area, the military area that he took his morning walks in when he was down there. It was fascinating to me. And if all of you, any of you haven't been there, if you ever get a chance, go. You'll never regret it. It's wonderful. And as Ike said, I had 2 other occasions to honor the President when I was in the White House. I identified with Harry Truman for many reasons, one of which is the pundits always told him during his first term that he was finished. I heard that a lot. Another is that he was nearly wrecked in his presidency by his attempt to provide universal health care to all Americans. And it was sort of fascinating to hear what people said. I actually, when they were pillowing me about it, I went back and read what was said about Truman, and it was almost like somebody put a memory chip in the heads of my critics from that generation. Actually, I think we're finally going to get it. Old Harry and I will have a last laugh sometime in the next couple of years. I admired him because he stood up for civil rights and human rights. And I admired the way he was both partisan and bipartisan. He never put any fancy varnish on what he believed. And he could be brutally tough when he was in a fight with the Republicans. And he needed to be because they were trying to get him every day. On the other hand, he could be refreshingly bipartisan whenever there was an opportunity for common ground in organizing America to deal with the Cold War, in protecting the national security of the country and advancing our interests around the world, and in his respectful treatment of his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, which I thought showed an extraordinary amount of class and also good sense, realizing that every former president has something to contribute. We forget now, but Herbert Hoover was the same age I was when he left the White House. And he lived 34 more years. Before he became president, he was one of the world's most acclaimed humanitarians. It would have been criminal to waste his evident mental abilities and his great experience. President Truman was big enough to get that, even though a surefire applause line for every Democrat for 50 years was to say something bad about Hoover. So I liked him. But what I want to say today, on this 50th anniversary of the library, is that the enduring legacy of Harry Truman is highly relevant to 21st century America. Oh, we've changed a lot. We've changed the bipolar world of the Cold War to a globalized world of states that compete and cooperate, threatened by stateless terror and the prospect that terrorists could get a hold of weapons of mass destruction. We all share common threats, from diseases like avian influenza to the threat of climate change to the destruction of vital resources necessary to sustain life everywhere. The world is losing trees and topsoil and drinkable water. Plant and animal species in general are disappearing from the earth at the most rapid rate in human history, and increasing numbers of petroleum geologists, including a lot of people who are conservative Republicans, believe we only have 35 to 50 years of recoverable oil left. Optimists say, no, we got 100 years. The oldest city in civilization by carbon dating is Jericho in the Holy Land at 10,000 years. That would mean we have 1% of civilization to figure out how to get along without oil. 70% of our oil in America we use to get around on. We don't need oil to get around on at all, except for jet planes. We haven't figured out how to build a biofuel that will lift a heavy plane in the air and fly it long distances. But the other 30% of our oil goes to fabrics, plastics, chemicals, lots of other things for which at the present moment, even though a lot of agricultural companies are doing research, we don't have viable substitutes. So it's a different world with different sets of challenges. The United States in Harry Truman's time was still, by and large, except for South Texas and pockets in California, a biracial country. And our race problem was a black-white problem. Today, while we still have that, we're very much a multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multicultural country, trying to hang on to the idea with which we started, that America was the only country founded with a purpose, based on an idea. The idea was that we're all created equal, and the purpose was that we had to form a more perfect union, without which we could never become individually and our families all that we ought to be. But Truman is still highly relevant to this increasingly interdependent world and our increasingly diverse society. The benefits of the world are evident. Most of us have claimed them. Most of us